Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon. Long time no see, as usual. So, I know I just did a book versus movie comparison not too terribly long ago for my last video on this channel, which was actually Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, in case you missed it. But the process of doing that one made me want to jump into doing another one just as soon as possible. Even though these take a long time, I actually really do like doing these. And for a very long while, I had been wanting to reread Richard Matheson's 1971 novel, Hell House, and compare it to its film adaptation, The Legend of Hell House, which was directed by John Hough, who also did some Hammer films, I believe. It came out in 1973 and is one of my favorite horror movies of the 70s, as well as probably one of my favorite haunted house movies of all time. So it had actually been such a long time since I'd read the novel Hell House. I think I was maybe a teenager in my 20s, which was a very long time ago, believe me. I had actually forgotten how much more lurid, how much more horrific, how much more over the top it was than the movie. Like, don't get me wrong, the film adaptation is quite faithful, which isn't surprising because Richard Matheson also adapted his own novel into the screenplay, but a lot of incidents that were in the novel were left out of the movie, especially ones of a more like overtly sexual nature. The book is a lot more sexually explicit than the movie was, and the ending of the novel is a lot more dramatic and gruesome and kind of more prolonged than the one in the movie is. So as I usually do in what will no doubt be a very long-ass video, I'm going to follow along with the general plot, and then I'll interject where there are kind of notable differences between the movie and the novel. As always, shouldn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. This post is going to have major spoilers for both book and film. This is your one and only warning. And like I said, this is probably going to be a long one, so get some snacks and settle in. So at the beginning of the movie, and at the beginning of the novel, there's a scene where a physicist and parapsychologist named Dr. Lionel Barrett, who in the movie is played by Clive Reville, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's taking on an assignment from this kind of crabby, dying old millionaire named Rudolf Deutsch. In the book, he's named William Reinhard Deutsch, but, you know, not a big difference. I don't know why they changed the name, but they did. So Deutsch wants to know if there's survival beyond death, you know, because he's creeping up on it very shortly. So he wants to know what to expect, you know what I mean? That's fair enough. And he is willing to pay a team of investigators 100,000 smackers each if they can prove it to him one way or the other, if there's survival after death or not. And just how are they going to definitively prove such a nebulous concept, you might be asking yourself. Well, Deutsch has purchased the so-called Everest of haunted houses, this massive mansion built back in 1918. I think in the movie they said 1919, but again, not a big difference, by this reclusive and completely degenerate motherfucker named Emmerich Belasco. Now, his house, which is now more aptly termed Hell House, has played host to pretty much every supernatural phenomenon like ever recorded. It's actually been empty for 30 years, 20 years in the movie. There had been two previous research incursions by paranormal teams, one of them in 1931 and one in 1940. These years are different in the movie, but again, doesn't really make much of a difference. But both of them ended with pretty much everyone going mad or dying in horrible ways. Now, the sole survivor of the 1940 incident, who was a physical medium by the name of Ben Fisher, who's played by Roddy McDowall in the movie, was actually found naked and curled in a fetal position on the house's front porch back then. This isn't explicitly mentioned in the film. I think Dr. Barrett just says he crawled out of the house with his sanity barely intact or something along those lines. So Fisher will actually be one of the team accompanying Dr. Barrett on this latest exposition into Hell House, which is going to last the week up until Christmas. So as I mentioned, all of this is very similar in both formats, but one of the major differences I want to point out right in the beginning is that in the book, Dr. Barrett is disabled. One of his legs is partially paralyzed from when he had polio as a child, and he kind of hobbles along with a cane and has a hard time, like, you know, doing stuff. This is not portrayed in the film in any fashion. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess it was just kind of logistics. They didn't want to make the actor, you know, kind of limp around for the whole movie. I don't know if that's why. But the thing about it in the book, like, his disability has also made him largely impotent, which factors quite a bit into like the later paranormal shenanigans involving his wife, who is named Edith in the book, but in the movie is named Anne, and she's played by Gail Honeycutt. So I'm guessing because like the sexual stuff in the novel, like that was in the novel, is toned down considerably for the movie. Maybe they figured they didn't need the disability slash impotence angle as much. But honestly, I kind of liked that aspect of the story because it's a nice parallel with what the team discover about Emmerich Belasco himself, like near the end of the book. Now, it is possible that Richard Matheson, when he wrote the screenplay, set up another kind of parallel in this regard, but I will get to that later. Oh, and also, in the book, Hell House is in Maine, but since the film is British, the movie house is in England. So the investigative group includes the aforementioned Dr. Barrett, his wife Anne/Edith, the aforementioned Ben Fisher, and a mental medium named Florence Tanner, who Deutsch chose specifically over Barrett's objections. Now, in the movie, Florence is played by the adorable Pamela Franklin, who's this little dark-haired elfin woman, who at the time of filming was 23 years old. In the book, Florence is 43 years old, and she's this tall, voluptuous, red-haired knockout. Like, she's, like, completely gorgeous. At one point, Edith even tells her husband that Florence makes her, like Edith, look like a boy. So, you know, very, very woman-y and hot. Now, in the movie, Florence's youth is another thing that's kind of used to minimize her views somewhat. I think there's a thing where Barrett even tells Deutsch, oh, she's just a child, or she's not much more than a child, or something like that. And though she is dismissed by Dr. Barrett in a similar way in the movie, or in the novel rather, she's actually much older and more experienced. So I think, I mean, she doesn't take any shit in the movie either, but in the book that makes more sense because she's older and she's kind of been around, you know? Matter of fact, there's a scene in the book where, before the team actually goes to Hell House, in which Florence is kind of sentimentally looking over this little spiritualist church that she founded and thinking how nice it will be to have that $100,000 so she can build a proper church for her congregation. So like I said, she's kind of been around like in the paranormal scene like for a while. So in the novel, there are actually a few more interactions with the characters prior to their arrival at Hell House. A lot of them kind of revolve around Barrett being apprehensive about taking his wife along on the trip. Now, in the book, Edith often accompanies him on his field work, if you want to call it that, and kind of played an integral part in helping him with experiment protocols. Like, she was the one that would search mediums for means of fraud at seances and things of that nature, and keeping records and stuff. Now, this time, because of the gravity of the situation, he's kind of hesitant to put her in danger, but she insists she wants to go along as usual. You know, what's the big deal? It's just another haunted house, right? Now, in the movie, Anne does mention that she always goes with him on his investigations, but she kind of seems more like just a tag-along rather than an integrated member of the team, or like his assistant, like she is in the book. In the book, there's also kind of a brief section from Fisher's point of view before he goes to the house, where they reveal that he was one of the most powerful physical mediums in the world when he was 15 years old, which they do mention in the movie, but not until much later. And 30 years later, he's pretty stoked like to get another crack at Hell House because he's mad that it kind of defeated him back then. So in both book and movie, there is pretty immediate tension between Barrett and Florence Tanner. Barrett is a physicist who has observed what he terms supernormal phenomena, but he believes it's essentially caused by purposeless energy, which is generated from living human beings, more like a poltergeist type of situation, in other words. Florence, by contrast, very wholeheartedly believes in the survival of the soul or the personality after death, and therefore thinks that hauntings are caused by literal ghosts who have their own agendas and are still intelligent. Now, as in the book, Barrett is having a machine built to his specifications that he is kind of obnoxiously confident will clear Hell House of all its manifestations by pretty much like counteracting and neutralizing all of the unfocused electromagnetic energy that's causing the trouble, theoretically. Now, the machine is going to be delivered a few days into their stay. In the book, the machine is specifically called the Reverser, but I don't think it's named in the movie. If it is, I don't remember. Now, neither Florence nor Fisher believe that this machine is going to do a goddamn thing, but Barrett is very, very eager to prove them wrong and is pretty much 100% certain that it's going to work. So the arrival at Hell House is similar in both formats, though in the novel, the house has a tarn, a marshy lake pretty much, on the property, that plays into the narrative quite a few times during the story, but does not appear in the movie, is not mentioned. Fisher tells the gang a bit later that this tarn is called Bastard Bog because during all of the debauchery that took place at the house during Belasco's residency, a bunch of women would get pregnant and they would subsequently drown their babies in the tarn. None of this is mentioned in the movie. I'll also note that the house has an indoor pool and a steam room in the book, which Barrett, uses a lot because of his disability. These also factor quite a bit into later events, but are not shown or mentioned in the film. In both the book and the movie, the electricity in the house is provided by generators and is ostensibly already on and ready for them. Now, in the movie, the team goes into the house and the electricity isn't working, but it really just takes a couple minutes. Like, Fisher finds the emergency generator and gets everything squared away, and the power is on for the rest of the movie. There's no problem. Now, by contrast, in the book, the generator that was supposed to provide the power isn't working. They suggest maybe it's because of some paranormal something or other. So they're kind of obliged to spend the first day there, like, creeping around with candles. In both book and movie, the house is dark as shit because all of the windows have been bricked up. Now, a crew in the book is scheduled to come the next day to install a new generator, and they're also going to build a cabinet for Florence to use during her seances. So the gang comes across a chapel while they're exploring the house, and Florence can't go in because the terrible vibes just overwhelm her. So the other three go in there and find that the walls of the chapel are covered with these pornographic murals, and the big crucified Jesus behind the altar has a ridiculously huge erect schlong. This is, of course, not shown in the movie. There is kind of a weird satanic-y looking Jesus on the cross, but he has a loincloth on. I looked pretty close. I was like, wait, does he have a big dick? I don't know. But yeah, in the book, he has like a huge dick, like a big erect dick. But he does have a loincloth on in the movie, and he just looks like he has normal-sized genitalia. And they only really show one mural on the wall in the movie, and it's kind of smutty, but like not all that shocking, So when they emerge from the chapel, they find that Florence has vanished, and they kind of panic for a bit while they look for her in the book, with candles in hand because it's dark in there, but the lights are on in the movie, so, obviously the lights are on. Now, they find her inside the Great Hall, and she's standing near this old-timey phonograph. Now, she says she heard voices in here, and she followed them and found this old record player, which seems to have wound itself up and started playing by itself, hence the voices. So when they play the record back again, it's Belasco's voice, and he's basically welcoming to the house and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't be here with you physically, or whatever, like saying creepy shit like that. Edith/Anne is weirded out, but Barrett is like, oh, no big. It's obviously the record was made decades ago before Belasco disappeared and presumably died, and it's just a coincidence that it sounds like he's talking directly to them. Fisher and Florence aren't so sure about this, though. And in fact, Fisher says that one of Belasco's favorite tricks when he was alive was to draw everyone's attention to a particular object, and then he would move among the crowd without them noticing him. Like, he was really good at influencing people like that. So Fisher speculates that now that he's dead, he's like, Belasco's spirit could have just walked right by us just now while we were all listening to the record. And then in the movie, they kind of like show it from behind as though someone's watching them, and there's like a little breeze that goes through the cobwebs or whatever, like, saying that he was walking around watching them. Now, a bit later on, after everyone has claimed their bedrooms and whatnot, Florence and Fisher explore a bit on their own. This scene is not in the film. Now, Florence picks up all kinds of impressions. She talks in a different voice for a second, like she's channeling somebody, and things of that nature. She also has really, really bad feelings about the steam room and the old wine cellar, which is kind of foreshadowing because shit will happen in both of those places later on, in the book at least. Fisher seems kind of bemused by this whole thing, and it's here where we start to suspect that Fisher might be closing himself off to whatever is in the house, whether consciously or not. Now, Florence actually accuses him of this very thing, but Fisher argues that he isn't feeling anything because there isn't anything there. So that evening, they're all sitting around at dinner. Now, in the movie, there was already enough food laid in for them for the week, with the implication that they were presumably preparing their own meals, I would imagine. But in the book, a couple from the nearby village brings them their meals and then kind of skedaddles again without being seen. Except for a couple times later in the book in a sort of couple of jump scare moments, you know what I mean? Because they kind of pop up and it's like, oh, we forgot you guys existed, you know what I mean? It was that kind of thing. So while they're at this dinner, like, the group decides that Florence will do a sitting, like, after they eat. Now, while they're eating, Ben Fisher, who has spent the previous 30 years, 20 in the movie, learning everything there is to know about the Belasco house, sort of regales them with the sordid history of the place. So Belasco, he says in the book, was the illegitimate son of a wealthy munitions maker, and his mistress, who was an actress. And he was very clearly evil from the start. Like he was saying, like he would cut up kitty cats, which I was horrified by, obviously. He raped his younger sister, all kind of fun stuff like that. So he gets sent off to boarding school, and he later inherited a shit ton of money when his father died. He was very well educated, particularly in the fields of religion, ethics, philosophy, and was a very strong believer in the power of will and was a master of influence over others. Also quite significant to the story was the fact that he was a huge man, like he was about 6'5", and he had a terrifying face, and people referred to him as the Roaring Giant. So after building Hell House, he started hosting dinner parties and salons and things like that, trying to recreate European high society in the United States. Obviously, this is from the book because the movie is already set in Europe, you know what I mean? But as time went on, the parties got more and more decadent and depraved. They kind of started going toward like drunken bacchanalias that would descend into orgies. You know, shit happens. We've all been there. I'm just kidding. Then finally, you know, it just kind of kept escalating until they got to parties where there was like every sadistic, twisted act you can imagine, including rape, bestiality, murder, necrophilia, cannibalism, feeding virgins to hungry leopards. Like I said, if you can imagine it, the people at Belasco's little parties eventually got around to it. And maybe even some shit you didn't imagine, you know what I mean? And it got to the point, in fact, where a large number of people simply never left the house, like for months at a time, and they sort of started becoming embroiled in Belasco's competitions to see who could come up with the most disturbing, fucked up shit. Like he would have a thing every day, like I don't know what kind of prize you'd get or anything like that, but he just said, let's see who can come up with the most fucked up shit. Okay, boss, and then they would try and do that, you know what I mean? So it's like the heat broke in the house, they never fixed it, so it was freezing cold in there, they never bathed, so they were pretty much just dirty and disease-ridden and just living worse than animals in this place. Now, sometime later, when someone came checking on a missing relative and knew that they had gone there, they found 27 people dead, many of them mutilated, half-eaten, who knows what else. Belasco, however, was nowhere to be found. Now, the house was sealed up shortly after that, and rumors of an extreme, very violent haunting began shortly after that, hence the interest from paranormal investigators over the years. Now, as I mentioned, all of that specific stuff was from the book. Some of this catalog of horrors is mentioned in the movie, but it mostly just kind of skims the surface, refers to Belasco's size, which, like I said, is kind of a big, significant element of the plot. There's kind of a general sanitized list of some of the iniquities that occurred. He does mention the fact that 27 people were found dead and that Belasco disappeared and nobody knows what happened to him. So later that evening, they sit down to their first seance. Now, Florence's cabinet hasn't arrived yet, at least in the book, so it's kind of an informal affair. They just sit around a table that has all Barrett's equipment on it. In the movie, they actually sit in armchairs in front of the fireplace. You know, not a big difference. Now, in the book, Florence sort of explains the difference between a mental and a physical medium, in case you didn't know. You know, basically a mental medium just has impressions and visions, can channel spirits, whereas a physical medium can levitate, make objects move, produce disembodied knocking, manifest ectoplasm, and so on, which was kind of more what Ben Fisher was known for back in his heyday. Now, in the movie, Florence goes into a trance and almost immediately starts communicating with some spirit or other. And at first, she just says kind of seemingly random things like extremes and limits, terminations and extremities. Then she says she senses a young man in the chair next to her. And after that, her voice changes and she begins ostensibly channeling this person, saying things like, I don't want to hurt you, but I will. Get out of here before I kill you all. Now, as things come to a head, objects start rattling around, like on the table next to her, which kind of shocks everybody because Florence is a mental medium, not a physical one, and has never made objects move before. Now, this all happens similarly in the book, but this scene actually goes on way longer and actually begins with Florence summoning her spirit guide, Red Cloud, who is not mentioned in the movie. Hilariously, when she communicates as Red Cloud, she talks like a stereotypical Indian, like in a racist old Western or something, saying things like, me Red Cloud, me come from afar. bad medicine, saying shit like that. You know what I mean? It's pretty ridiculous. I mean, this is admittedly pretty cringy, but in the book's defense, I think that it was kind of like a joke because in real life, spirit mediums often claimed that they had Native American spirit guides and did hokey voices like this when they talked to them. So that's accurate. And also, even in the context of the book, the three other investigators just kind of chuckle and roll their eyes at it like, oh my God, that's the stupidest shit ever. Matter of fact, later in the book, Fisher even kind of scoffs to himself about the whole red cloud thing, like he's kind of thinking about it, implying that he doesn't think, like, there's no way he thinks Florence is communicating with a real dead Native American, like a spirit, and is simply, like, making him up and maybe portraying him as she thinks others would expect him to sound, although maybe she's not doing it consciously. So anyway, Florence is surprised to learn that she caused physical phenomena while she was in her trance, because like I said, she doesn't know what happens in the trance. They just tell her about it after she wakes up. But she kind of takes the whole thing in stride, basically saying, oh, God works in mysterious ways and all that. Fisher, though, is clearly starting to think that maybe something more nefarious is going on. Now, in the book, there's a scene immediately after this where Barrett and Edith are in their room. Barrett is working on his manuscript. I don't know if they mentioned that he's writing a book in the movie, but he is in the book. And he's talking to his wife, and then suddenly a rocking chair in the room like starts to move of its own accord. Now, Edith is freaked out by this, as you would be, but Barrett assures her, oh, it's not a ghost, it's just some residual psychic energy floating around, nothing to worry about, no big deal whatsoever. This incident is not in the movie. We then check in with Florence, who's getting ready for bed and kind of thinking about the events that just transpired. And suddenly, the door to her room opens by itself, and she hears footsteps coming toward her. Now, she believes this to be the spirit of the young man that she was speaking to earlier, so she's not alarmed at all and simply begins asking who he is and what's going on. She doesn't think it's Emmerich Belasco because this spirit seems to be in anguish, like she can feel that, and she doesn't believe that Belasco was capable of feeling that. But she finally gets the impression that this is Belasco's son, Daniel, who is a person that no one was certain ever existed. Like, she can hear him breathing and whispering to her, and she offers to help him. Now, in the book, he actually snatches the comforter off the bed and throws it over himself so she can see his shape, thus confirming for her that he is not Emmerich Belasco because he's not 6'5". He also grabs her ass. Like I said, the book is much more sexual, so I'm just warning you about that right now. They took a lot of that out of the movie. There's a little bit of it in the movie, but not as much as the book. I mean, the book is pretty smutty. Now, in the movie, he actually pulls off the comforter and throws it over her head because he's mad because she asks him, well, why are you still trapped in this house if you're so clever? And then he kind of tantrums out of the room with this rush of wind and a sob, and the door slams behind him. Now, the next couple of scenes in the book do not appear in the film at all. The first involves Barrett and Edith going to try out the steam room, which, like I said, is not mentioned in the movie. The power is still out at this stage, so they go in there with candles, and Edith starts seeing the shadows in the room, like, start doing really creepy things. Like, she sees Barrett's shadow, and it starts getting big and, like, turning, like, into this monstrous, weird shape or something like that. So she gets really wigged out by this, and they leave. After that, Florence goes to Fisher's room to tell him about her visit from Daniel, but he's asleep. So she actually ends up going to Emmerich Belasco's old room instead, and she opens herself up and gets impressions of what we're led to assume are maybe the circumstances surrounding Daniel's birth. We then pick up the movie thread again with the following scene where Florence goes into the dining hall and finds Barrett and his wife having breakfast. Now, Florence quite cheerfully tells them, oh, I've partially solved the haunting, I figured it out. She asserts that the haunting is caused by the tormented spirit of Daniel Belasco. Now, Barrett clearly does not believe this happy horseshit at all, thinking that Daniel is probably just a figment of her imagination. At this point in the book, the crew arrives to install the generator and build Florence's cabinet. They also bring a cat at Dr. Barrett's request, since he's convinced that animals can sense psychic energy better than humans and will kind of serve as an additional verification of any untoward energy or presence or whatever in the house. There is also a cat in the film, and he doesn't make it in either medium. Sorry to say, he dies like pretty horribly in both things. But the cat in the movie, it's never really explained where he came from. Like, they show it outside, so they're almost implying maybe it was just a stray, or maybe it just like came in, or maybe it was like a spirit cat or something like that. But in the book, it's very specific, like the crew brought the cat because Dr. Barrett asked for it. So then we have the second seance, this time done under very stringent scientific conditions. Now, in the movie, we kind of just see through context clues, Florence is wearing this kind of skin-tight leotard to keep her from hiding anything. She's sitting behind this net type situation, like with her hands and feet on electrical sensors that will set off alarms if she moves them, and so on. In the book, there's kind of more of a setup with Florence kind of teasingly getting very offended at all this rigmarole she has to go through to ensure she isn't faking anything, but she's used to it and she knows because she's been through this before. Now, one thing that definitely isn't in the movie is the bit where Edith is kind of tasked with going into Florence's cabinet, which she's kind of in there in position, and doing a full body search on her to make sure that she isn't concealing anything in any of her, orifices, as mediums would do back in the day. You know what I mean? Now, it's established that Edith has done this countless times before, like I said, because her husband does this kind of shit all the time. But for some reason, this time she gets super flustered, especially because Florence is like smoking hot and isn't embarrassed at all by this very invasive procedure. So Edith, while she's kind of going about it, like keeps feeling like there's some unseen presence or something is like watching her. And when Florence spreads her legs so Edith can like inspect her vagina, make sure she hasn't stuffed anything up there, Edith's probably like, nope. And she just like nopes out of the cabinet. And then she tells her husband, yep, I did it. Bye. You know what I mean? So he kind of notices she's acting a little bit weird, but really doesn't think that much more about it. I'll also note here that in the book, Edith seems to not mind much that her husband is largely impotent, because like I said, in the book, he's disabled from polio. She herself, it's established, is afraid of sex. Now, we discover later on that she was raised in a very religious household where sex was seen as shameful, and we find out even later that her father may have molested her, hence why she married a much older impotent man, it's suggested. It's also stated pretty overtly that she may have latent lesbian tendencies, though given the events of the book, I think bisexual would be the more accurate term because she seems equally into women as men. None of this is mentioned in the film, though it is implied that Anne is sexually frustrated and repressed, which is a weakness that the entity in the house will use against her, just as he does in the book. Now, once the seance begins, Florence again goes into a trance, and in both the book and the movie, everybody starts to smell ozone, and Florence starts to emit ectoplasm from the tips of her fingers, and it kind of comes out and like weaves into these tendrils and starts to rise up toward her face. Now, I don't know why this part was always funny to me, but like Dr. Barrett, he very dispassionately asks Florence, or asks the ectoplasm, I guess. It's like, hey, can you leave a sample in the jar, please, that he has sitting there? And the ectoplasm very politely obliges. Now, in the movie at this point, Anne wigs out and screams for some not very clear reason, which startles Florence out of the trance and ends the seance in a premature retraction, as they call it, of the ectoplasm, which actually kind of shocks Florence's system some because it just goes right back in. Now, in the book, the seance goes on longer. The ectoplasm actually forms this sort of ragged, linen-looking mask, like around Florence's face, and it eventually morphs into a partial male face and figure, like a part of a torso and arms, and it kind of laughs creepily at them, looks at Edith, and reaches for her, like with its arms, at which point Edith understandably screams and abruptly ends the session. So like I said, in the book, there's, it makes a lot more sense, like why Edith screamed and stopped. In the movie, I couldn't figure out, like, what she was screaming at, but yeah, in the book, like, the ectoplasm monster is like, blah, like that, and she's like, fuck, you know what I mean? And that wakes Florence up. So that makes more sense to me. So just as in the movie, Edith apologizes to her husband for interrupting the festivities, but he's actually doesn't really care all that much. He's very pleased with the data that he got, and he tells his wife, hey, check this out, like, look in the microscope. He has that sample of the ectoplasm, like, on a slide he's been looking at. So he notes that it's almost all organic material, mainly cells from Florence's body, mixed in with particles of just dust, fabric, other things that were just floating around in the air, just regular shit. And this actually bolsters his theory because it's very plain that the ectoplasm isn't otherworldly in any way, but was just formed from Florence's body and other things just in the atmosphere, like it just kind of pulled it together. So that's, a phenomena that he has a name for. He calls it organic externalization of thought. So the following scene, which is similar in both book and movie, has Florence kind of recovering in her room. She's in there with the kitty cat. And the cat suddenly kind of bows up and like hisses at the door, at which point a figure appears under the covers of the bed. Now, in the book, Florence can see the ghost junk outlined in the bedspread. Told you there was a lot more sexual stuff in the book, and we're not even close to close to the most explicit stuff. And in the book, the spirit even yells "boo" at her before, like literally, before laughing at her and then collapsing the covers. She ends up scolding him. Like I said, it's kind of funny. She's not scared of him at all. Like I said, she's been a medium a long time. She's used to this kind of crap. You know what I mean? She's just like, "You motherfucker." And then, so she yells at him. He gets mad, breaks some shit in the room, and then storms out again and slams the door. In the movie, pretty much, the scene isn't quite as prolonged. He doesn't yell boo at her or anything like that. She basically just pulls the bedspread back and sees that nobody is there. I think he does whisper to her, though. So Florence goes down to dinner and tells Fisher and the Barretts that Daniel was in her room again. Now, Barrett is not shy about hiding his annoyance at her continued belief in Daniel. And Florence starts to get really worked up, basically telling Barrett, "Look, I'm tired of being belittled and mistrusted by you. I didn't choose to be a medium. Sometimes it sucks. And having to do all this stuff for you, like performing under scientific conditions, that's really onerous. I'm not a machine." You know what I mean? Barrett can barely get a word in edgewise, wondering where this sudden tirade has come from. And then suddenly all hell breaks loose. Like dishes start flying everywhere. The huge chandeliers over the table start swinging back and forth. And this massive like wooden dining table just slides across the room and kind of smashes up against the fireplace. Now the bulk of the phenomena does seem to be aimed at Barrett. And indeed he is injured in the whole melee. Now at a word from Florence, everything stops abruptly. And at this point she turns to Fisher and says, "You'd better leave the house." Now he doesn't know what the hell she's talking about. But she's all, "You're the physical medium, buddy, not me. So you must have done that." But of course, Barrett and Fisher are convinced that Florence was the one responsible for the manifestations, whether she was a mental medium up to now or not. Especially because she was the one getting righteously pissed off with Barrett right before all the shit hit the fan, right? Now, she doesn't believe she's the one who did it, but Fisher tells her maybe she had better leave because the house is starting to use her. So Edith and Barrett go to their room to kind of tend to Barrett's wounds. And Barrett tells Edith, his wife, that she should leave too because the investigation is just getting too dangerous. But Edith refuses to leave. Now Florence, who is questioning whether she really was responsible for this outburst, she actually prays for a bit, at least in the book. I don't think they show that in the movie. And then she goes into Barrett's room to speak with him. And she tells him that the attack was not actually her, but was Daniel, and that Daniel was only trying to pin the attack on Florence in order to get everyone in the house to turn on one another to make them easier prey. Now, obviously, Barrett is not convinced because he doesn't think Daniel is real, and he basically tells Florence to get the fuck out. Now, later that night, Edith/Anne is lying awake after Barrett has fallen asleep. In the movie, she sees kind of the shadow of this erotic statue in the room, and it starts to move on its own as though the figures are having sex, and then she hears like all this sexual moaning. And then when she kind of blinks and looks back at it, like the shadows are normal again. In the novel, she gets out of bed kind of restlessly, and she goes over to the shelves to find something to read. One of the books falls open, and its pages are all hollowed out, and inside it are a bunch of old photographs, all of which are pornographic. Some of them were very obviously taken in the Great Hall of the house and have people like having sex on the table while a bunch of other people like stand around watching them, shit like that. So Edith is disgusted, but also kind of intrigued. You know what I mean? So she shoves the photos back in there, like she's kind of embarrassed, and she puts the book back on the shelf and gets back in bed, but then starts to feel like someone's watching her again, like just the same feeling that she got when she was in the cabinet, like inspecting Florence, you know what I mean? So she tries to tell herself, oh, you know, Lionel is right, there's no such thing as ghosts, but it's clear she's not really convincing herself. Meanwhile, also in the novel, Fisher is downstairs drinking a bourbon to try to calm his nerves when a very harried Florence comes downstairs and says she's looking for Daniel. Now she goes off toward the dining hall, and Fisher kind of considers going with her, but then sort of decides against it. He's like, man, I'm just going to let her do her thing, you know what I mean? He also speculates that Florence is entirely too open to the house and is going to have a real bad time because of it. Now, suddenly, in a scene that is not in the movie at all, Fisher sees a figure coming down the stairs and heading toward the front door. He's very shocked to see that it's Edith, and he starts after her. wondering at the same time if it's really her or if the house is trying to trick him by like showing him a hallucination. So he follows her as she goes outside, and he realizes that she's heading toward the tarn. So he actually runs and panics and like catches up with her and grabs her and leads her back to the house, but she's just completely out of it, and she doesn't even notice because it's freezing cold outside and she's just got jammies on or whatever, and she doesn't even seem to notice that. So Fisher puts her in front of the fire so she can warm herself back up, but she starts taking off her pajamas, despite him being like, hey, the fuck you doing? You know what I mean? Knock it off. So she gets naked and like pushes herself up against him, but Fisher slaps her, which kind of snaps her out of this trance that she's in. So she looks down at herself, like horrified, obviously having no idea what she was doing. And Fisher's like, hey, you know, it's fine. You were just sleepwalking and you were going toward the tarn, presumably to drown yourself. And he also tells her pretty much just to get her to feel better. It's like, it's the house doing it. It's not you. But Edith just kind of stares at him with this terrified expression and then runs back upstairs, clearly very embarrassed. This scene, as I said, is not in the film. There is a very similar sequence to this in the movie, and it happens in the book too, but it happens like a lot later in the book. So we then check back in with Florence, who has been drawn to the cellar in her search for Daniel. So her psychic senses sort of hone in on this particular wall in the wine cellar, and this unseen force like grabs her throat and starts flinging her around, like ostensibly to try to keep her away from the area. So, you know, undaunted, she kind of presses on, finally touching the wall and being just flooded with certainty that Daniel is behind it. In the movie, Florence does find Daniel in a hidden room in the wine cellar, but a ghost doesn't really try to prevent her from getting to him. She does see, I believe, like a flash of an apparition that looks like the remains that they ultimately find, at which point she screams and summons the others. Now, in the novel, Barrett and Edith are awakened by Florence screaming, and when they rush into her room, not the wine cellar as in the movie, they find her in bed with these horrible bite marks around her nipples. This also does not happen in the movie. Fisher kind of joins them in short order. She tells them that Daniel is punishing her and that she found Daniel's body in the wine cellar the night before. You know, she didn't technically find it, but psychically she found it, you know what I mean? So Barrett is naturally skeptical, but she's basically pleading with him, you know, please help me tear down the wall so they can exhume Daniel's remains and give him a proper burial, which she thinks will, you know, largely end the haunting. Now, obviously, Barrett is disabled and wounded from the poltergeist attack, so he's not much good like in tearing down walls. So Fisher says that he'll help her do that. Now, in both the book and the movie, the gang discovers a mummified man shackled to the wall in the wine cellar, though in the movie, the body is just kind of in a secret room type situation, while in the book, they have to remove a section of wall with a crowbar, like before they find him. Also in the book, the corpse is wearing a ring with the initials DB on it, thus confirming for Florence that this is indeed Daniel Belasco. In the movie, there is no ring. In both mediums, though, Barrett is not convinced that this is actually Daniel, claiming it could be pretty much anybody, and that he needs more proof. So Florence is, kind of understandably, frustrated by his stubbornness, and she tries to convince him, look, we have to work together to help me. We have to work together to solve this because it's possible that both of us are right. So Barrett says, you know, I need more time to come up with an interpretation of these events, and essentially blows her off in what's a pretty arrogant fashion, not gonna lie. He later tells Edith that even though the body is clearly real, there's no way of knowing whose it was, and he also asserts that Florence is unknowingly using her power and that of the house in order to bolster or maybe even completely construct her case, like the narrative that she's come up with. He also thinks that the bite marks on her breasts are akin to stigmata, like in other words, unconsciously self-inflicted. So Florence and Fisher bury the corpse on the property and say prayers over it, hoping this will end much of the phenomena. In the book, after the funeral, Florence kind of clasps Daniel's ring in her hand and has a bunch of visions of him, like starting out as, you know, happy and innocent, but sort of growing darker and darker as he falls under what you're led to assume is the corrupting influence of his father, right? Now, in the vision, she sees and feels herself falling into this big, like, endless black pit. And she's kind of terrified of the power that she senses, like, emanating from Belasco's spirit. Now, when she partially awakens in her room, she hears the door open and close and footsteps approaching again. And then she feels someone sitting on the bed, and she sees a figure, like a black paper cutout, like sitting there. She senses this is Daniel, but she's confused because she buried his body in consecrated ground, and by all rights, he should be at rest, yet here he still is. So she asks him why he's still in the house, and he tells her he can't leave, and that she knows what she has to do in order to free him. She won't do whatever this is, and he says, well, then he'll have to kill her, at which point she feels these really cold hands around her neck. She panics and wakes out of this because she's kind of been in this weird, like, half trance this whole time. And then she finds the cat in the bed next to her, and it's making this really weird noise. And then it attacks her, kind of clawing and biting at her before she's able to fight it off by, like, hitting it in the head with the phone receiver. And then she locks herself in the bathroom to kind of tend to her wounds while the cat is out there, like, scrabbling at the door trying to get in. Now, the cat attack scene, like, you know, from the point where the cat attacks her, that occurs similarly in the movie, but most of the lead up with all of the stuff about Daniel coming there and asking her and, like, her having the vision with the black pit and all of that, that is not in the movie. Now, at this stage, Barrett's machine, the reverser, arrives, and he starts to unpack it. Now, in the book, obviously, he has some trouble doing this because of his disability and his injuries from the earlier poltergeist incident. And while he's struggling with it, he's telling Edith about some of the amazing stuff that Fisher did at some of his seances when he was a kid, you know, because he was hot shit back then. So it's clear from this discussion that Barrett does believe that both Fisher and Florence are legit, that they're real mediums, but he just doesn't believe that their powers come from anything supernatural necessarily. So like I said, this discussion does not occur in the movie. Now, in both the book and the film, Fisher interrupts the machine unboxing to tell the Barretts that Florence has been hurt again. So they all rush up to see her and find her completely scratched up and covered in cat bites. So Barrett kind of gets to work on her wounds with his medical bag, and she tells them that Daniel possessed the cat and attacked her. Of course, Barrett isn't having this because, like I said, he doesn't believe Daniel is real, but they don't argue about it at this point because he's probably sick of arguing about it, right? He does tell her, again, that he thinks that she should leave. He's like, you know, I would be remiss in my responsibility if I didn't tell you to get the fuck out of here right now. You know what I mean? And she just will not go. So he's like, well, I'm kind of washing my hands of the whole situation. You know what I mean? Now, that night, Edith can't sleep again and decides to have a bit of a tipple of the brandy that's in their room. Now, in the book, it's specified that she never really drank before because her father was an alcoholic and she was afraid she would become one too, but this is not mentioned in the film. She does drink some in the movie and does get drunk and stuff, but her history with it isn't really mentioned. Now, after a few slugs, she decides that she should find Fisher and apologize to him and thank him for saving her from walking into the tarn. So she goes in his room and starts kind of poking around before he comes in and sees her. Now, he tells her, look, you really shouldn't be wandering around alone in here, and maybe you should tie your wrist to the bed, like to keep you from sleepwalking. He also says that she shouldn't drink in this house and that she's starting to lose control. So she gets very upset and defensive at this and leaves the room. This sequence is not in the movie. The following scene is similar in both mediums. It has Fisher going to see Florence as she's recovering in her room. He basically tells her that he agrees with Barrett that she should leave because she's being quote-unquote torn to pieces. She protests about this, but Fisher asks, well, how are you so sure that it's Daniel doing all this and that you aren't being fooled? Fisher then points out to her that one of the mediums on the investigation with him back in 1940, whose name was Grace Lauder, was convinced that the house was haunted by a pair of sisters and seemingly had evidence backing up her case. She ended up slashing her own throat. Now, this last bit about the sisters and the throat slashing is not in the movie, but the rest of that conversation is. I will also note here that during this conversation in the movie, Fisher mentions specifically how all the people with him back in 1940 died, such as falling from balconies, being crushed or crippled by heavy objects, and so forth. This ends up tying in with the discovery of Emmerich Belasco toward the end because all the people died by having something happen to their legs. This angle is not in the book. All of the people died in different ways that didn't have anything to do with legs. And this is kind of what I meant when I said earlier that this might have been the parallel that Richard Matheson set up in the screenplay after taking out the whole disabled Barrett thing. That was a big part of the novel. That was kind of my perception anyway. I could just be talking out my ass, but that's kind of how I interpreted it. So in the book, Florence goes on to tell Fisher about her brief time as an actress and how she was embroiled in a bit of an overblown scandal, like back in Hollywood, because she was a spiritualist, and it wasn't any big deal or anything like that. She also mentions that she had a brother who died at 17 of spinal meningitis. And it's later revealed that it was this incident that influenced the house / Belasco's spirit to target her with the sympathetic character of Daniel, who was about her brother's age and needed her help, much as her brother had back in the day. Now, before Fisher leaves the room, Florence tells him she wants to do a sitting later to try and contact Daniel and asks if Fisher will sit with her, and he agrees to do that. None of this is in the movie. Likewise, the following rather terrifying scene does not appear in the film, unfortunately. I think they should have put this in there, but, you know, what are you going to do? I can see why they left it out. So Barrett is swimming in the pool to try and soothe his various pains. So he and Edith then go into the steam room, and Edith, obviously under the influence of the house, starts getting a little bit frisky. She takes off all her clothes, climbs into Barrett's lap, and starts working furiously as Lil Wayne there. And she orders him to make it hard. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's a direct quote. So Barrett is quite shocked, and he's unable to perform. Like I said, he's largely impotent. I think he can do it every now and then, but you know what I mean? It's just mostly not a thing. And he's actually pretty flabbergasted to see his wife act this way. He's never seen her act this way before, like sexually aggressive. And not only that, just the way she's kind of manhandling him is worsening previous injuries, like to his head and his hand that he got like from the poltergeist attack, because he was pretty beat up. So he pushes her off, and she, you know, gets mad and like stomps out. Now Barrett tries to go after her, but finds that the door to the steam room won't open. Now, as Barrett starts to get more and more apprehensive, the steam in the room starts to thicken so much that he can't see anything. Now, Edith tries to get the door open from the outside, but it won't budge, so he tells her, "We'll go get Fisher, and you guys see if you can get it open." So after she scuttles off, Barrett starts to hear this weird slithering noise in the steam room. Now, he's trying to convince himself it's just his imagination, because, you know, he's very skeptical, and he starts groping around for the tap wheel to turn the steam off. But he gets this gross black muck on his hands, and it can't figure out what it is. And then he realizes that the slime on his hands smells just like the tarn. And as he's crawling around, he feels something blocking his path to the door that essentially feels like a disgusting blob monster. He said it almost felt like a rotten mushroom or something like that. Like it felt like that. And he even sees it for a second, like a split second, before Edith and Fisher are able to wrench open the door from the outside and drag him out. Of course, when they rescue him, there's no black ooze and there's no monster. Now, there are a couple brief scenes in the book after this that aren't in the movie. One with Fisher kind of contemplating everything that's going on, and one with Barrett trying to tell Edith to leave the house, and also saying that everything will be over and done with tomorrow after he turns the machine on. Now, he's very adamant that even though what happened to him in the steam room was horrifying, he knows it wasn't ghosts, and he's so convinced that his machine will work that he says that he would rather die than leave before he can prove it. I'll note also that there's a scene somewhere around here in the movie where Florence goes into her bathroom and sees kind of a creepy creature-like shadow behind the frosted glass of the shower. But when she opens the shower door, there's nothing there except the dead cat, like laying there all bloody on the tiles. Florence also finds the dead cat in the book, sliced in half to be specific, but it happens much later in the story, like under different circumstances. In the novel, Florence and Fisher sit for kind of an impromptu seance to contact Daniel, ostensibly. So Florence goes into a trance and produces another ectoplasmic figure that talks and claims to be Daniel. He tells them that it was indeed his body they found in the wine cellar, but when they asked Daniel if he was the one who possessed the cat, the one who bit Florence on the nipples, and attacked Barrett in the steam room, he says it wasn't him. He also says, again, that he can't leave the house, but he won't really tell them why. Eventually, they get him to confess that his father's spirit was the one who possessed the cat and did all those other things, but the ectoplasm pretty much dissipates immediately after he makes this statement. After Fisher tells Florence what happened while she was in a trance, she starts to become convinced that Emmerich Belasco's spirit is so powerful that it's keeping Daniel here, and that she's the only one who can help him. And she also feels vindicated because she says she knew that Daniel wouldn't have done any of those horrible things, and that Belasco must be trying to turn her against Daniel. Fisher is not sure that that's exactly what's going on, but he does seem to concede that it sort of makes sense. In the book, Edith wakes up with another hankering for some booze, and she finds herself feeling very angry and very uncharitable about Lionel's impotence in the steam room earlier. Though she then kind of catches herself, like wondering where all the hell these terrible thoughts are coming from. Now, as she drinks more and gets more and more inebriated, she also finds the hollow book again with all the porno pictures in it, and she starts staring quite lasciviously at this particular photo of a woman, like, licking another woman's pussy, pretty much. She looks at it for a minute like, oh yeah, like, and then she, like, tosses it away, like, disgusted with herself. Like, because she's, like, really frightened at all of these feelings, like, welling up inside of her. Now, this bit, like I said, is not in the movie, but this next part is. So Edith/Anne goes downstairs and finds Fisher. Now, in the book, Fisher is actually prying open the crate containing Barrett's machine because he knows that Barrett couldn't do it, but in the film, he's just kind of hanging out. Now, Fisher immediately realizes that she's very drunk, and she almost immediately starts coming on to him, like talking about all the sexual shenanigans that took place around the table, like back in Belasco's day, forcing Fisher's hand onto her tit, stuff like that. Now, Fisher tries to snap her out of it, telling her it's the house doing it, but she insists it's not the house, it's me, I'm doing this. Now, in the book, she gets really angry, like she accuses Fisher of being impotent also, and then basically she pops her blouse open, and she asks him specifically if he's ever had a tit before. Try it, it's delicious. That's what she says. She also says to Fisher, and this is a direct quote, "Suck them, you fairy bastard, or I'll get myself a woman who will." Now, in the movie, this is very similar, but she actually proposes a foursome between all of them. Like, you know, you, me, that girl, Lionel, like, we're all going to get drunk and fuck each other. And she does say a similar line to what I just said, but she specifically says she'll find someone who will, like, touch her, not specifically a woman. Now, in both mediums, Lionel suddenly comes downstairs and sees her. In the book, she immediately collapses and, like, falls unconscious. In the movie, she just sort of wakes up out of her trance and looks mortified and, like, quickly covers herself back up like, oh shit, I'm busted. The following scene, not in the film, has Florence having some kind of vision or out-of-body experience, and she's dancing in a ballroom with someone she assumes is Daniel. They say they love each other and everything is magical and beautiful, but then Daniel suddenly yells in alarm, and it startles her out of the trance, and she realizes that she's standing ankle deep in the tarn, like it's really cold water, and she's walking into it, like she's gonna drown herself. So she kind of turns around and she's struggling to get out, and she sees a very tall figure dressed in black disappearing into the fog outside. So obviously terrified, she makes her way back to the house, and then Fisher brings her a drink. She tells him that she saw Emmerich Belasco and that he had tried to kill her by getting her to walk into the tarn, but that Daniel had saved her life by, like, yelling and waking her up. She then explains to Fisher that she thinks Hell House is a rare case of what she calls a controlled multiple haunting, in which Belasco is controlling all the other surviving personalities in the house, like a general with his army. That's a direct quote from both the book and the movie. This last part of the conversation, like I just mentioned, that occurs in the movie as well, but in that case, they're just sitting in Florence's room talking, since Florence doesn't almost walk into the tarn in the film, and nor does she actually see Emmerich Belasco outside. In the book, Florence decides that the best strategy for clearing Hell House is to free all the other spirits that are trapped there, which will theoretically drain Belasco of much of his power. At least that's what she thinks anyways. So she goes into her room and starts talking to Daniel, trying to assure him that he can leave the house if he truly believes he can. Like, he can't keep you here, you know what I mean? And then, this doesn't happen in the movie, but she takes out a pad and a pencil and does, like, automatic writing. Now, the words on the pad, presumably communicated by Daniel, say, "one way only." Now, this kind of makes her furious. She says no, and she rips the paper away. Again, we are not told until later what exactly Daniel is asking her to do, but given the heavy sexual element of the book as a whole, you can probably figure it out. This scene is not in the film, as I mentioned, and nor is the following one, where Fisher is standing out at the tarn, contemplating how it almost killed both Edith and Florence, and then he gets startled by the approach of the couple from the village that I mentioned earlier that brings them their food, but have never been seen up to now. So there's a bit more of, like, Fisher's thoughts about Florence's plan, and then Barrett comes downstairs and, you know, says thank you to Fisher for finishing the unpacking of the crate because he wasn't able to do it. So the movie picks back up about here. Fisher wants to talk to Barrett about the situation with Edith/Anne, but Barrett shuts him down. He's clearly very embarrassed and uncomfortable discussing it, which I guess is kind of understandable. Now, in the book, Fisher tells Barrett that Edith almost walked into the tarn the previous night, and Barrett is shocked by this and says, why didn't you tell me? And Fisher says, well, Edith should have told you, and the fact that she didn't means that the house is really getting to her just as it's getting to all of us. It's like it's affecting you too. Now, Fisher says almost this exact thing in the movie, but he's actually referring to the previous incident with Anne, not the thing with the tarn, because that obviously didn't happen in the movie. In both mediums, though, a very cranky Barrett then accuses Fisher of being shut off and tells him that Deutsch is wasting a third of his money because Fisher isn't doing what he was being paid to do. In both the book and the film, Fisher then realizes that Barrett is absolutely right and that he has been closing himself off from the house in order to keep his sanity about him, presumably. So he feels kind of guilty about this, especially because Florence keeps getting her ass kicked, you know what I mean? And he's just like skating along doing nothing. So he sits by the fire and opens himself up completely to the house's energy. In the movie, he almost immediately starts shrieking and contorting in agony. In the book, there's kind of more detail about what's going on inside his head, specifically him having like the sudden sensation of this overwhelming black force that feels like it's just rending his mind and body apart, you know what I mean? In the movie, he just sort of passes out. In the book, the feeling kind of subsides, and he's just left really weak and, wrung out. And he wonders if the house is just toying with him, just to be fun, like until it eventually like finishes him off. Now, in the book, just kind of apropos of nothing, there's actually more of an urgency element involving the crippled and injured Barrett being not sure that he's going to be able to get his machine up and running in time to clear the house before they're all scheduled to leave. In the movie, the machine is pretty much in working order, with just some kind of minor tinkering necessary, and there really isn't any uncertainty about whether it will be finished in time because, again, in the movie, Barrett is able-bodied. Also in the book, there's a flashback scene about here that takes place at the same time as the earlier one where Edith went downstairs and tried to hump Fisher, but this time it's from Lionel's point of view, like him waking up in his room and coming down and seeing her. Now, there's then a sequence similar in both mediums where Barrett and his wife have a really awkward conversation about the whole incident, although the specific words they use are different in the book and the movie, but the gist of it is about the same. Now, meanwhile, Florence is in her room, kind of exhausted because she's been praying for Daniel's release like for hours and hours, but she still senses him there, like right around her. Now, she goes downstairs to talk to Fisher, and in both the book and the movie, she immediately notices that something is wrong. Fisher does not tell her specifically that he opened himself up to the house and got his ass psychically kicked, but he does tell her that he doesn't trust anything or anyone in this house anymore, and there's no way they're going to be able to handle what's going on here. Florence does not believe this is the case. She's like, we got this. It's fine. Like, don't worry about it. But Fisher is just not having it. He's good, now that he's experienced the full force. He also reiterates that there's no way that Florence can be certain that Daniel is real and that it's very possible she's being tricked. He then admits to her, yes, I have been shut off and I'm going to stay that way for the remainder of the experiment. Then I'm going to collect my money and go on my merry way. And he basically advises Florence to do the same or she's not going to make it. Now, this is all in the movie, but there's a bit afterwards that isn't. After Fisher storms off, Florence is thinking about what he said about her being tricked. And she suddenly realizes that the words Daniel spoke to her during that happy ballroom vision that she had were exactly the same as dialogue from a TV show she had acted in like a long time ago. She also realizes that her dying brother, David, the one with meningitis, had also said some of the exact same things to her that Daniel had said. And that one of David, her brother's main regrets was never having sex with his girlfriend, Laura, before he died. So Florence realizes with horror that Daniel has been using the memory of her brother's death and virginity to manipulate her into helping him and possibly letting him like invade her physically. So this sequence of Florence waking up to the fact that she may have completely fabricated Daniel or that Daniel isn't who he claims to be does not happen in the film. In the movie, she does eventually figure it out, but it's a bit later on. Now, in the book, Florence goes to the chapel after hearing a whisper telling her to go there. And she becomes determined to get inside, despite, because like I said, she hasn't been in there up to now because it's just too much. She can't, like, it's overwhelming for her. It's just this powerful evil, like, emanating from it. So she starts praying and using her general psychic fortitude or whatever, and she is finally able to battle her way in there. Now, when she gets in there, she finds a Bible on the altar that has a birth record for Daniel Belasco from 1903, thus seemingly vindicating that he really did exist. Neither the Bible nor the birth record appear in the movie. Now, in both mediums, the following scene sees Barrett working on his machine with Edith/Anne when they're approached by Fisher, who has been drinking some, and insists that he's going to stay drunk enough to dull his senses for the rest of their stay. He basically calls the machine a pile of junk, it won't do jack shit, and he tells the Barretts they should just forget about the machine, chill out and do nothing for a few days, tell Deutsch whatever the fuck he wants to hear, collect your checks, that's what I'm planning on doing. So when Barrett declines to do that, saying, no, man, the machine's going to work, like, trust me, like I said, he's very, very, he's confident to the point of delusion, really. Fisher basically says, he's like, look, I was the only one to get out of this house alive back in 1940, and I'm going to be the only one to get out alive this time, too. So the following scene sees Florence arguing with Daniel about his request to free him by, you guessed it, letting him have sex with her. In the book, as I mentioned, she had started to doubt that Daniel existed, but then conveniently found the Bible with his name in it, thus getting her back on board with the whole Daniel situation. That didn't happen in the movie, so Florence is still operating under the assumption that Daniel is real and is who he says he is. Now, in the book, Daniel kind of lays on the charm, talking about how much he loves her, and then he tells her that Barrett's machine will work, but that it will simply drive him from one hell to another. This line also appears in the film, but it's actually Florence that says it, and there is no conversation in the movie where Daniel specifically states that Barrett's machine will drive him out. The following bit, also not in the movie, has Barrett and Edith in their room, kind of trying to navigate the awkwardness that has blossomed between them. Hey, after we get out of here, we'll have a long discussion about the shit that happened in this house, you know what I mean? And they're kind of anticipating having the machine up to snuff by the following day. Now, Barrett uses his tie to fasten Edith's wrist to the bedpost so she can't wander around again, like after he's fallen asleep. Now, later that same night, she's laying awake and she sees the rocking chair in the room start moving by itself again. In the book, Florence is in her room thinking that she should perhaps damage Barrett's machine to keep it from sending Daniel away. But then she kind of thinks better of it, realizing that the house might be placing these thoughts in her head, right? Now, the phone in her room starts to ring, even though it's disconnected, and she doesn't really want to answer it because she knows who it is. I mean, obviously, how else would it be? It's a ghost phone. So she eventually picks it up anyway because I guess the ringing is driving her crazy. And of course, it's Daniel. And he just starts endlessly pleading with her, please, 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 like to do as he asks before the machine is turned on. So she resists for a while, but finally his constant haranguing is just too much for her, and she agrees to do it, kind of trusting that God and her spirit guides or whatever will protect her. So the movie picks back up about here. So we have Florence undressing, lying on her bed, and giving herself to Daniel. In both the book and the movie, Daniel starts having like invisible sex with her, and after a moment, Florence opens her eyes. In the movie, she just screams, and we never see what she saw. Like, we just have a close-up of her face, and then it cuts to black. But in the book, it's made clear that there is essentially a rotting corpse, like with evil yellow eyes, like raping her and laughing gleefully at her as he does so. In both the book and the movie, Fisher and the Barretts come running at the sound of Florence's screams, and they find her naked and unconscious on the bed, like there's blood trickling from various wounds and whatnot. In the book, Fisher leans over her and she whispers the word "filled" to him before smiling creepily. This does not happen in the movie. Both the book and the movie have a subsequent scene where Fisher is watching over Florence as she sleeps. When she wakes up, she kind of seems to be oscillating between being her very terrified self and this leering evil spirit that's now possessing her. Now, while under the influence of the spirit, she very teasingly asks Fisher, oh, were you the one that put this nightgown on? Did you enjoy it? Why didn't you sleep in the bed with me instead of in the chair? Shit like that. Now, when she comes back to herself, she tells Fisher that she can feel the spirit inside of her. She still believes it's Daniel, but she now believes that he lied to her about sex being the only way, to free him so that he could possess her body. Now, Fisher insists, I'm going to get you out of here, but Florence is like, Daniel's not going to let me leave. So this is all in the movie, but in the novel, this scene goes on longer, like after this point. So Fisher tells Florence, I'm going to get you out of here, pack your shit, we can leave right now. And she heads to the bathroom, like to pee and get her stuff, but she keeps kind of getting intermittently possessed, you know what I mean? Now Fisher says, if you go in there, don't lock the door, like if I can come in and help you if, you know, you get possessed and you need help or whatever. So she comes back out, but she's naked and basically tells Fisher to strip so they can fuck. Now, Fisher pleads with, it's like, look, just, I know there's a spirit inside you, just fight it. But she keeps insisting that she wants to fuck him until finally he has to smack her, you know what I mean? At which point she kind of comes back to herself and she's very ashamed. Now, Fisher starts to doubt his ability to get her out of the house safely after this whole situation. So they go downstairs and tell the Barretts that they're leaving, and Fisher tells Barrett about the possession. This is similar to what happens in the movie. He wants to get the hell out as soon as possible, but Florence is like, no, I want to stay for a cup of coffee. You know what I mean? This exactly doesn't happen in the movie, but it's kind of a similar deal. And then she gets Barrett to tell her exactly how the machine is going to work. She seems to be acting like herself, but in both the book and the movie, we're led to assume that this is the possessing spirit trying to get some scuttlebutt about the machine. You know what I mean? Like how it works. Now, the book has a very long explanation of how the machine theoretically does what it does, but it's much more simplified in the film for obvious reasons. I mean, you know, in the book, it's kind of like a couple of pages where it tells you how it works, you know? Now, in both mediums, Florence then kind of breaks away and runs at the machine with a crowbar, the same crowbar they've been using to open the crate. She breaks a bunch of the dials and knocks Fisher out, like she whacks him in the head. And then Barrett kind of wrests the crowbar, like, away from her. Now, in the movie, the scene ends about there. But in the book, Barrett falls down because he's disabled, you know what I mean? Like one of his legs doesn't work. And he drops the crowbar. So Florence snatches it up and starts coming at Edith, calling her a lesbian bitch, quote unquote, and telling her she's going to smash her skull in. Now, Barrett's kind of writhing around on the floor. He can't get up. Florence chases Edith up the stairs. Edith tries to lock herself in Florence's room, but doesn't make it in time. And Florence comes in, throws her clothes off, and basically falls on top of Edith and, like, sexually assaults her. So Florence, or rather, you know, the spirit that's possessing her, knows that Edith's father tried to rape her and knows that Edith has lesbian/bisexual tendencies and, like, starts taunting her about it. This whole incident is interrupted by Barrett, who finally has gotten up and kind of comes in the room and snaps Florence out of her trance. So Florence runs into the bathroom, like realizing what she's done, and she's horrified. And then Edith kind of falls into her husband's arms, like kind of traumatized, obviously, by this whole horrible situation. So obviously none of that is in the movie. In the book, Barrett then gives Florence a sedative and puts her to bed. And Fisher is likewise recovering from getting beamed with the crowbar. You know what I mean? Kind of fucked his head up a little bit. Now, Fisher tries to get up, saying he has to get Florence out, like, before shit gets any worse. But Barrett's like, you know, just chill the fuck out. Like, I will get Florence out of Hell House ASAP. Like, don't worry about it. Now, he tells Edith he's going to call an ambulance for Florence and Fisher. And he's like, when the ambulance comes, you need to go with them. Like, y'all all need to get out of here. He also says this whole shit show is going to be over this afternoon after the machine does its thing. But he's like, but I'm going to stay until the very end to make sure that it works and that my theory is vindicated. I don't believe there was any intention to call anyone an ambulance in the movie. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember, you know, anyone saying anything about that. Barrett then tells Edith, he also says a similar thing in the movie, that Florence trying to fuck up his machine is like the ultimate tribute to it. She was so afraid of Barrett being right and her being wrong that she was willing to destroy his life's work, essentially, to kind of maintain her delusions. So like I said, this general conversation is in the film too, although it takes place at the machine itself, like while Barrett is assessing the kind of minimal damage. In the book, they have this discussion in their room. And Barrett also adds that Florence was not possessed by anyone, but was just manifesting a part of her personality that she usually kept hidden from them. A bit later, Barrett is planning on going downstairs to call Deutsch's assistant or his guy about getting an ambulance. But Edith has fallen asleep and he doesn't want to wake her. But he's also reluctant to leave her alone in the room because bad shit usually happens when you leave people alone in the house. You know what I mean? So he decides, you know what? It'll just be a minute. I'm just going to pop down for just a minute and I'll make the call and rush back. What could possibly go wrong in such a short time? He finally gets through to Deutsch's guy on the phone. And the man tells him that Deutsch died earlier that morning. Now, since Deutsch's son is next in line to take over the estate, and since the son thought the whole Hell House experiment was a ridiculous, stupid waste of time, this now means that none of the Ghostbusters will be getting the money that they were promised, the $100,000 each that they were supposed to get. So the man feels bad about this whole situation. He's like, man, I never liked that Deutsch motherfucker anyways, and his son's even worse, you know? So he's like, I feel bad for you guys, so I'm telling you. He also tells Barrett that the son straight up told him to just leave the investigators stranded out at the house. Like, don't even bother to go get them. You know what I mean? They had a car, but you know what I mean? They're just like, don't even go, like, do anything. This rather shocking turn of events does not occur in the film. It's actually presumed. They don't really, say anything outright, but you're led to assume that Deutsch is still alive. Nobody mentions that he died or anything like that, and you're led to assume that he paid the $100,000 to the surviving members of the team. Like I said, they don't say this, but they also don't say that he died and that they're not getting their money. But in the book, yeah, he's dead and they're not getting the money. So the next scene in the novel sees Florence waking up in her room with Daniel's voice like ringing through her head. He actually makes her pee the bed. And then he starts mocking her. Like, she can see his face kind of superimposed, like, over the lampshade, like, laughing at her. So she runs for the bathroom, and he grabs her ankle and, like, pulls her to the floor. Now, she manages to get back up and stumble into the bathroom, but Daniel essentially, like, possesses her. And then or at least she perceives that he starts, like, fucking her in the ass. And then she believes that she sees Edith come into the bathroom and come down and like start licking her pussy, you know? And Florence seems to be, because she's kind of going in and out of possession, she seems to be like enjoying herself quite a bit. But then she sees her reflection in the mirror and she realizes that she's alone, that she's basically there like shoving her fingers into herself and imagining all of this. So horrified, she runs back into the bedroom and Daniel is laughing at her like she can hear him laughing at her. And she tries to put a robe on, but he keeps snatching it out of her hand. She tries to pray, but Daniel keeps making her say this crazy sexual shit. So she basically bites down on her fist, like hard enough to draw blood, and the pain actually sends him away temporarily. So Florence then leaves her room and heads for the staircase, but she keeps seeing spirits of Belasco's victims and kind of like tableaus of things that happened in the house back then. Like a man cutting off a woman's head. There's like another guy like chewing on a severed hand, like that kind of stuff. Like real gross shit. So she heads for the chapel, and this is where she finds the dead cat in the book. He's like sliced in two. Now, when she's in the chapel, she's just, again, like marveling at this tremendous power that she feels in this room. And she vows that she's going to beat Daniel. But as she approaches the altar, the large crucifix back there comes loose from the wall and falls on her, like essentially crushing her. Now, the crucifix also crushes Florence in the movie, but all the stuff leading up to that is book only. Now, in the novel, Florence, who is obviously dying, manages to crawl out from underneath the crucifix, and she starts cutting at her wrists, like with the nail sticking out of the wall where the cross had fallen from. So she's kind of on the brink of death, and she's realized exactly what's going on with the house, and she feels compelled to try to get the message across to the others. So she draws what appears to be a letter B inside a circle, like with her own blood that she got from the wrist slashing. Now, she does the same thing in the movie, but she never crawls out from under the cross, and she doesn't cut her wrist with the nail. She just gets blood from her legs or something like that. In the book, Fisher suddenly wakes up with this really bad feeling and rushes to Florence's room to find that she's not there. He then looks into Barrett's room and notes with fury that Barrett has left his wife alone. So he's really mad at Barrett right now. He's like, look, not only did you not give Florence enough sedative to keep her out, like she's up wandering around, but you also left your wife by yourself, which I told you not to do. So when Barrett comes back from making the phone call, Fisher pretty much like lets him have it. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you leaving them alone? But then he realizes with horror that Florence has probably gone to the chapel. Like, he's psychic too, obviously, so he just gets that impression. So the three of them rush down there and find Florence dead. Now, Fisher notices the symbol that Florence drew in her blood, but at first doesn't know what it means. The three of them also find Florence a similar way in the movie, but the stuff prior to that didn't really happen. Like the whole thing about him yelling at Barrett about leaving them alone and all that kind of stuff. In the novel, Fisher actually carries Florence's body out to the car, where he like kind of communes with it for a little while. And then Barrett turns on his machine. Now, in both mediums, everybody has to wait outside for a few hours while the machine is running because the radiation would kill them if they stayed inside. Now, in the book, Barrett then tells Edith and Fisher, hey, Deutsch is dead and we're not getting any money. And both of them at this point are just so over this shit that they are just like, it doesn't even matter anymore. Whatever. In both the book and the movie, the gang go back into the house after the machine has done its job so they can check and make sure that the house is clear. Now, Fisher is initially skeptical, and he's very reluctant to open himself back up to the house, because remember what happened last time, but Barrett assures him everything will be fine. The machine worked, you're fine. So Fisher finally does it, like he finally opens up, and is quite astonished to discover that Barrett is right. The machine works, he doesn't feel anything. After this, there's a scene in the novel that isn't in the film. Fisher, we're led to assume, like, drives Florence's body to town, like in the car. And as he's driving back, he's kind of pondering on everything that happened with Florence and what the symbol that she drew meant. And then as he gets closer to Hell House, he starts feeling this horrible sense of dread that things in the house are not over yet. There's then a scene with Edith and Barrett talking about, what a triumph the machine was. She's like, oh my God, I'm so proud of you. You're going to get a Nobel Prize or whatever the fuck. You know what I mean? Like, it really worked. This is going to change the world, And then they're talking about, man, how glad they'll be to get out of this house. Like, we fixed it. And what a shame it was that Florence died right before it happened, like, so she couldn't see it. So a similar conversation to this, like, happens in the movie, too. So Barrett actually leaves Edith upstairs. She's kind of taking a nap. And he goes downstairs to check on all his stuff. Now, he notes to his disbelief that as he's kind of frittering out and packing his stuff up, the needle on the machine starts moving up the dial, as though the evil energy in the house is returning. Now, obviously, his skeptical ass is like, this is impossible. There's got to be something wrong with the machine, because it worked. You know what I mean? It seemed to. And then he starts freaking out as, like, the tubes and the dials start shattering, and the thermometer starts registering this, like, drop in temperature. Now, a bunch of doodads on the machine, like, explode and essentially, like, drive shards of glass, like, into his eyes and face. This is similar to what happens in the film, but the two mediums kind of diverge a bit after this point. So in the book, Barrett actually gets knocked to the ground and starts getting flung about by this unseen force. The force then bodily drags him into the pool area, like banging him against the stairs and, injuring him quite severely. Like, he's basically getting the shit beat out of him by an unseen something or other. So the force then flings him into the pool, into the water, and holds him under. And as he's drowning, he sees the figure of a man standing at the edge of the pool, and then everything goes black, like he dies. Now, Barrett dies in the movie, too, but he's actually lured to the chapel and crushed under a chandelier rather than drown in the pool. So he actually dies pretty similarly to how Florence did in the movie, but in the book it's totally different. In the novel, after Barrett is dead, and obviously Edith doesn't know this because she was sleeping, she actually wakes up and she hears someone come into the room. She thinks that it's Barrett, and it sounds like Barrett, but she can't quite see him in the darkness. So Barrett, like, kind of sits next to her and strokes her hair and says, oh, we should have sex because it's been such a long time. And then he roughly grabs her tit. And she gets a little put out by this, like, hey, knock it off, you know what I mean? And he gets angry, saying, oh, Fisher and Florence were good enough for you, but I'm not. Like, he's talking like that. Then he starts, like, roughing her up some more, and then the lights come on, and Edith screams her fucking head off because the thing grabbing at her is essentially just a severed hand that's crawling around on its own. Like Thing, but, a lot more rapey. So Edith runs the fuck out of the room, and all manner of paranormal shenanigans occur. She's put upon by, like, this swarm of moths. She sees a bloody, naked Florence leering at her, obviously spirit because Florence is dead and gone. Tables and shit start flying around, shit starts breaking. And she also sees an apparition of this soaking wet woman in a white dress holding a dead, malformed baby. You're led to assume, even though, because the mention of it was a long time ago, but you're led to assume this is one of the women from Bastard Bog who had, like, drowned one of her babies. So much like what happened with Barrett, Edith isn't really in control of her own body, and she keeps, like, falling and hurting herself and being thrown into things. So she calls out for her husband, and he calls back to her, and she sees what she thinks is him running toward her. She kind of, like, falls into his arms. But then when she backs up and looks at him again, she realizes it's her dad, who is naked, and he's, like, holding his enormous dick, like, in both of his hands, like, at her. Like, you know what I mean? Like that. Like I said, this book is very, very sexual, as I'm telling you. I don't know if you didn't know if you haven't read it, because the movie has a little bit of sexual stuff in it, but not nearly as much as the book does. The book is, like, super smutty. So she panics at this, obviously. She's almost kind of like, I'm going to off myself. She, like, tries to climb over the stair railing. And she's seemingly rescued by Barrett, though of course it isn't really him. Like I said, she doesn't know he's dead yet. So she gets whisked to the theater in the house where Barrett, or what appears to be Barrett, ties her up and, like, rips all her clothes off. And then she sees a bunch of people in the theater, like, cheering. and she notices a leopard like stalking toward her, which is a reference to the earlier incident of like the leopard eating the virgin that happened while Belasco was alive at one of his weird parties. So she feels herself being attacked by the leopard, like she could feel it like kind of eating her. But then suddenly everything disappears and she's lying on the stage alone. And then she sees a shadowed figure sitting in the last row of theater seats. Presumably this is Emmerich Belasco, and he welcomes her to his house. So Edith then gets up and kind of scrambles out of the theater, and she keeps seeing Barrett popping up and like mocking her like everywhere she turns, you know what I mean? So she finally makes her way to the swimming pool and sees her actual husband very clearly dead, like laying there in the bloody water. So she freaks the hell out and is then grabbed by Fisher, who basically hits her to knock her out so he can pull her out of the house because she's panicking and hysterical. Obviously, none of this happens in the movie at all. So in both the book and the movie, once everything has settled down a bit and they're outside, Fisher tells Edith, look, I have to go back inside and finish it or die trying. Edith does not want him to go back in for obvious reasons, but he says he has to. Pretty much for Florence, he wants to do it for her. In the movie, they both immediately go back in together. But in the book, Fisher actually makes Edith leave in the car and stay in the town nearby. He's like, basically, I don't know how long this is going to take. All I'm asking is just come back to the house, leave me some food on the porch like once a day, and then get the hell out of here again. It's like, and I'll come out if I'm done, or maybe I'll be dead. Who knows? So in the book, there's actually kind of it's not that long, but there is like a bit of a sequence where Fisher is in the house by himself, and he's kind of amazed that it feels pretty much completely dead now. Even though obviously there's still some paranormal shit going on. Like he listens to all Barrett's tapes of the seances in order to try to figure out what it all meant and what Florence was trying to tell him, but he still really can't make heads or tails of it. So he vows to stay in the house until he's solved the problem. And at one point, he opens himself fully to the house once again and feels a force pushing him, seemingly trying to lead him somewhere. Now, he doesn't sense any hostility from this force, and he soon realizes, to his delight, that it's actually Florence. In the movie, there is no suggestion that Florence's spirit has returned to help Fisher, but in the book, he seems to think it's her anyway. So she apparently leads him to the chapel and kind of shows him the Bible with Daniel's birth record. And then she also sort of psychically guides him to the Bible quote, "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out." The significance of this is initially lost on Fisher. He's like, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. I will note that Fisher says this quote in the film as well, but it's after he's already figured out what's going on with the haunting, and he says it to Anne, who remember is with him in this bit of the movie, whereas in the book he's by himself. So back in the novel, Fisher is standing there confused when a strip of wallpaper like kind of tears down by itself behind the altar, and he sees like a bit of a plaster wall behind there that looks like it was just thrown up not that long ago. And then he feels the medallion that Florence gave him, which is not a thing. Like, he doesn't have a medallion in the movie, but like, yeah, Florence gave him one in the book. He feels it like burning his skin, and then it breaks off into pieces and falls on the floor. And then one of the pieces seems to like turn like it's an arrow, like it's pointing at something. And then as Fisher looks at it, he's suddenly hit full on with this kind of irresistible power of Belasco's spirit. And it knocks him backwards and simultaneously reveals everything about what's happening with Hell House. Like all the knowledge like comes to him at once. Now Fisher, at this point, dazed and no longer in control of his body, walks kind of like a zombie, like out of the house and starts to walk into the tarn. And he sees like a horrible apparition of Belasco pushing him under the water. At this point, like he can see him and he's being pushed under, and he's like, and he knows he's going to die, and he's like completely okay with it. Just in the nick of time though, Edith returns and is able to pull him out of the tarn before he drowns. So they both sit in the car with the engine running for heat. Fisher's kind of too messed up to talk for a long time, so they kind of sit in there for a while. So when he finally kind of recovers, he tells Edith that the entire haunting was only ever Belasco. His spirit was so powerful that he could essentially manipulate reality to bend to whatever someone wanted or needed to see. He could like pretend to be lots of different personalities and stuff like that. So Barrett was actually right. There was no spirit of Daniel. It was only Belasco pretending to be a vulnerable young man in order to break through Florence's defenses, because he knew that that's what would get to her. Everything that happened in the house was only Emmerich Belasco alone. Hence why Florence had drawn the B in the circle, like all him, you know what I mean? Fisher also tells Edith that Belasco is still in the house, the machine didn't get him out, and Fisher is now certain that they will never be able to expel him. None of this happens in the movie other than the reveal of Belasco being the only ghost. So in the book, Edith wants to go back inside the house briefly so she can gather her husband's things. And although Fisher is reluctant, he eventually goes along. He's like, man, I don't want you going in there by yourself, even though, man, I really don't want to go back in there, you know what I mean? So as Fisher goes in there and starts packing stuff up, he starts to wonder why Belasco didn't just crush him like he did to Florence, or drown him like he did to Barrett. Like, why did all he did was make Fisher wander off into the tarn, like to kill himself? So Fisher starts to suspect that maybe Belasco's power has been diminished somewhat by Barrett's machine. Although he and Edith are debating the idea that they're like, look, if the machine did work, why would Belasco have allowed it to be used knowing it would weaken him? It's like he could have easily destroyed it, or Barrett, before Barrett even turned it on. So there had to be some reason. So as they're having this discussion, Fisher realizes that Belasco might have done it because of ego. The same arrogance that led him to reveal his secrets to both Florence and Barrett right before he killed them. Now, Fisher surmises that Belasco was so egotistical that he would have wanted Barrett to be able to use his machine first, like saying, hey, you were right, it does work, but guess what, I can still get you, before he, killed Barrett then and revealed everything to him, like a kind of a final fuck you, you know what I mean? Like, hey, I let you weaken me and then I can still kill you anyways. None of this is specifically mentioned in the film, although Fisher does note Emmerich Belasco's gigantic ego kind of as his main driving force, I guess. Fisher further theorizes that Belasco might be trapped in the chapel now and can't really use his powers to any great extent, like in other parts of the house. And can maybe just, like I said, maybe just make people do things, but can't throw people around or anything. Now, in both the book and the movie, Fisher seems to have a revelation repeating Florence's words about terminations and extremities, like from the first seance that they had. And he runs into the chapel, essentially challenging Belasco. It's like, hey man, here I am, destroy me, if you can, you know what I mean? So then there are footsteps and the floor starts to shake. And then there's an explosion behind the altar. So in the book, Fisher and Edith both see Emmerich Belasco, big as life and twice as ugly. And he kind of, from how they described him, was this huge Rasputin-looking motherfucker who starts walking very menacingly toward them as Fisher continues to taunt him about, hey, how come he never went outside? Basically, he's calling his mother a whore, saying he was a sawed-off little bastard, stuff like that. Now, he says similar stuff in the movie, but he's just yelling it into the wind and noise in the chapel. In the movie, they don't see an actual apparition as they do in the novel, where in the novel, the ghost actually comes at him, really big, but then as Fisher, starts yelling at him, he starts, the ghost starts getting smaller and smaller, as Fisher berates him until, in the end, he, vanishes completely. So all the stuff that Fisher is saying in both the book and the film refers to the fact that Belasco was very, very sensitive about his illegitimate birth, and specifically a lot about his super, super short size. So it was essentially the power of his raging ego that kept his spirit alive all this time. And now that Fisher has deflated that ego, all of his power is gone. So in both mediums, Fisher and Edith/Anne find a secret room situation behind the altar, which contains Belasco's preserved body sitting in a chair. Now in the movie, he's sitting there all fancy, with a glass of wine in his hand. In the novel, Fisher notes that he placed a jug of water next to his chair before he seated himself and sealed himself up in the room, and through the force of his will didn't drink any of it and eventually died of thirst. So Fisher then takes a penknife and stabs Belasco's leg, revealing to Edith/Anne that his legs were prosthetic. Belasco had evidently been so ashamed of his short size that he had his own legs cut off and walked around these tall prosthetic ones so he would look like a giant. Now, to be perfectly honest, I always thought this secret behind Belasco's haunting was a little bit lame, even when I was a kid. But I will let it slide because both the book and the movie are so fucking good otherwise. I mean, you can't have everything, right? So, in both book and movie, Fisher realizes that the reason Belasco was still able to operate at a diminished capacity in the secret room behind the chapel was that the walls of it were sheathed with lead. meaning that Belasco had already figured out, decades earlier, that there was a connection between surviving death and electromagnetic radiation, and that had placed his body in a safe room to make sure no one could use a machine like Barrett's to dispel him in the future. Interestingly, in the movie, Fisher and Anne turn Barrett's machine back on after they open up the lead room, thereby completely clearing the house of Belasco's presence, we're led to assume. And then they leave, presumably to collect their $100,000 and go back to their lives, you know what I mean? Now, in the book, because Belasco was essentially defeated by Fisher standing up to him and making fun of shit he was a total snowflake about, I guess, this doesn't happen. They just leave, with Fisher wishing her a Merry Christmas, because like I said, it was the week leading up to Christmas. I have to say, in this regard, the book is great, but I like the movie ending better. Just in this aspect, it seemed a lot more definitive, you know, opening up the lead room and turning on the ghost extermination machine again, kind of like hosing the place down with Raid, you know what I mean? But it's like, yeah, your mileage may vary, I guess. So that's all she wrote for The Legend of Hell House / Hell House. Sorry, it was very long. Incidentally, as I was researching this video, I came across a similar book versus movie discussion on YouTube about it. And one of the commenters, I think it was the guy from Rotted Reviews, who I really like, by the way, said that he would love for someone to write a prequel novel about everything that happened in Hell House when Emmerich Belasco was still alive. A Hell House origin story, if you will. Now, I discovered, because of that suggestion, because I'm like, wow, that is a good idea. But I discovered there actually is a prequel novel written by Nancy A. Collins, but it covers the 1940 investigation when Fisher was 15, not the original stuff with Emmerich Belasco. Not gonna lie, I still want to read that one. But then, like, as I was thinking about an Emmerich Belasco origin story book, I'm like, maybe I should write that. Like, I'd have time to do that. But I mean, it's a cool idea though, right? I think so. So thank you very much if you've listened to this entire thing. I really hope you've enjoyed this ridiculously exhaustive and very nitpicky breakdown. I had a lot of fun doing this, actually, even though it took forever. And I just hope I haven't worn out my welcome with how fucking long this is. But this kind of I love this kind of shit. It's like, you know, because I'm kind of a nerd like that. So hopefully if you guys are still here toward the end, I guess you guys are nerds too, and that's okay. So yeah, thank you very much for watching the video. Remember, if you liked the video, remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you guys in the salon next time. Bye.